Hello and welcome to the fourth chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will be looking at how to open and how to jam as a short stack. We will look at different stack sizes and different positions and investigate how we should adjust our range when covered in the PKO tournament as opposed to how we would play in a normal vanilla example. For this chapter, we will be using the same spot we looked at in the previous chapter where we were focusing on the bigger stacks, but instead look at the short stacks. The reason I'm not choosing a different spot is to make comparing a little bit easier and to not constantly have changing bounties and stack sizes and everything. So this is, again, the $530 bind PSKO, where everyone has a starting bounty, so 125 on their head, and the big blind is 500 with a starting stack of 25,000 chips. So the shortest, or the first short stack here, which is money, has, let's check exactly, 13,000 chips, which is about half of a starting stack, right? So we will start by looking at his strategy, and we want to see how much tighter should he be opening when covered. Because that's the thought process behind it. When we are covered, then people are more incentivized to play against us. Therefore, we should open a tighter range. We will get 3-bet more, and we will get called a lot more. So overall, yeah, we just want to be opening a tighter range. But how much tighter? Well, let's have a look. Again, we will follow the same thought process as before, where we want to compare what happens in the normal tournament to what happens in the PKO example. So first, let's have a look at how we should be playing this spot if this was a non-PKO normal vanilla tournament. This is always our starting point. This is how we should be opening, so we should be raising about 21% frequency, mostly consisting of high cards, of course. So suited 8x would be the bottom of our range. We would go 4s plus, all suited aces, and then 8th, 9 off, and most offsuit broadways. Only folding some Jack 10 off, Queen 10 off. This is pretty standard. Now, what happens when we are covered then? So, as I said, we want to be opening tighter. How much tighter? Well, not that much. Our opening range is still going to be pretty tight. So you can see that, yes, we do fold a little bit more. For example, we don't open ace-9 off anymore. We don't open any of these offsuit broadways. We don't open hands like Jack 8 suited, Queen 8 suited. So slightly tighter, around 2%. It is not a very big difference. Now, one reason for that is that the first players to act after our raise actually want to be playing a very call-heavy strategy. Again, we will focus on the response to an open in the next chapters. So I won't go too deeply into it, but I still think it's worth mentioning briefly. We can see that, for example, MP, the guy to our direct left after we open, is mostly calling and only 3-betting 3.5% of the time. The same goes for hijack, and the same goes for cutoff, and so on. So, because they end up calling and not really 3-betting, we can raise first in a fairly wide range because our equity realization will be pretty high. I think it is very important to adjust to our table. A lot of people will still be misplaying the spot and they will be 3-betting a much higher frequency than they should and not calling enough. So what happens in these cases is that we actually want to be opening tighter because our equity realization goes down. Opening hands such as say Queen Jack off or King Jack off and so on will no longer be profitable because we just have to fold those to a 3-bet. We don't get to see a flop and we don't get called by dominated hands as much. So we do get to open about 2% tighter, but in practice, in most fields, we should actually be even tighter than this because we will get 3-bet way more. On this spot, one thing I want to look at is what would happen if instead of us having a starting bounty, we instead had 1.5 starting bounties. So we had, for example, knocked someone out the previous hand. So how should that change our strategy? In the example we saw already where we have a starting bounty, this is, as we said before, about 13 blinds added to the pot. If we have 1.5 starting bounties, then this would be around 19 big blinds added to the pot when we are all in. So our bounty starts becoming a very significant portion of our stack size. So in that case, what usually happens is that we actually start opening even tighter. So now we can see we go to 17.5%, where we start folding some ace-2 suited, we start folding even more suited 8x, start folding queen jack off, and so on. Again, when we open, people behind are mostly supposed to call and not do much 3-betting. So once again, the concept where we should be even tighter against most of our opponents still applies. It's not a spot where we can be opening as wide as this when people 3-bet us. What I would like to see next is, let's go back to us having a starting bounty here, but instead of us having 26.5 big blinds, let's assume that we have 15 big blinds. What would change then? Well, then we would get to open even tighter than before. Looking at this, we want to be jamming a lot of the middling part of our range, so jamming ace-king off, ace-queen off, ace-jack off, and then also jamming a lot of the middling pocket pairs. We overall have to be very, very tight. We can only VPIP about 15% of our hands. And now we can see hands like queen jack off or suited 9x just immediately have to fold. Now that the bounty is such a big portion of our stack, we can see that we actually play a very different range to Chippy V. We can jam a lot wider. These hands aren't jams, the normal Chippy V situation. And we also just have to fold a lot more. This suited 9x row being the prime example, and has like queen jack off, ace-4 suited, etc. One thing to note is that when we raise these kind of marginal hands, we also just don't really plan to fold. So for example, let's say we open and then it falls the big blind who jams on us. He's supposed to jam any ace-x, as we can see, pocket pairs. Broadway is just a very linear range. And after we get jammed on, we just don't really fold. The big blind is supposed to jam so wide, and we just call our entire range against that. If, let's say, the button jumps, who again is supposed to jump pretty wide, against the button jam, we still get to call almost everything. We just fold some king jack offsuit. So most of these hands that we raise aren't going to be raise folds. They are going to be raise calls. One of the reasons that we don't jam is, first, we get to make quite a bit of money when we go post-flop with those. For example, a hand like king jack suited, king queen suited. They make a lot of money when we get called and we dominate their calling range. But then also is that we get to avoid a multi-way all-in situation. A hand like jack 10 suited, for example, is not a profitable jam here. In normal Chippy V in vanilla situation, it would be. In the PKO example, it is not. The reason being that we just don't really fold enough strong hands behind. People call us way too wide because of the bounty element. And also, again, we just get to avoid multi-way all-in situations. I cannot stress this enough that these suited hands are just not profitable jams compared to the normal vanilla tournaments that we're used to. If we look at the EVs of jamming, here you can see that always like queen 10 suited, jack 10 suited, these suited aces, pocket fives, pocket fours are just not going to be profitable. So here we already see one of the concepts that I explained a bit in the theory section, where when we are short, we actually have to play tighter in a PKO than a normal tournament because we just don't really have as much fold equity. In this example, when we jam, we can see that, for example, the button gets it in super wide. And same goes for example, the hijack. We can see that we just don't really fold out enough hands. The big blind is calling us with about 37% of his range, which again, of course, looks very, very different to what it would be in a normal vanilla example. People would just fold way, way more. So because of that, we just don't get to jam some hands which are very clear jams in a normal vanilla tournament. This is also something that I see a lot of people doing wrong in the tournaments I play. They jam about the same kind of hands in a PKO and a normal tournament when it clearly shouldn't be the case. When your bounty adds a lot to the pot and therefore you get called wider, a lot of these suited hands just no longer get to jam, as well as like low pocket pairs. And to picture that a bit better, let's now look at this pot again, but assume we have 10 big blinds instead of 15. So starting bounty, which adds about 13 big blinds to the pot, and we have 10 big blinds. 10 big blinds is so 10k chips with out of a 25k starting stack. How tight do we get to play them? And once again, for this pot, I would like to do a comparison between the normal vanilla strategy and then the PKO strategy. So for the vanilla spot, here we go. We are supposed to play a strategy that looks like this. So we're supposed to be jamming about 18% of the time with 10 big blinds and raising about 4.5%. We can see that we jam every pair, we jam every suited 9, every suited ace, ace 8 off plus, offsuit broadways, at least the better ones like queen jack, king jack, and so on. And we get to infuse with our top of our range and some of the hands that are in profitable jams but have good blockers like ace 7, king 10, king 8 suited. It seems like a fairly straightforward strategy, and I think it's pretty common to play close to that. So what changes with the bounty? Well, we do see the same concept as before, where first of all, we actually want to be jamming a lot more instead of raising, because we just don't really have that much fold equity. Even hands like aces want to be mostly jamming here, because when we jam, then our opponents behind will just call super wide. The big blind is supposed to call literally 90%. So because of that, we just aren't really incentivized to min raise. Then also, one thing that stands out is how much tighter we get to jam. You can see that even with 10 big blinds, hands like 4s, 3s, deuces, ace 2 suited, the suited 9x, these hands just don't make it into the jamming range. So compared to before, you can see that our jamming range tighten up, but then also becomes more linear in terms of absolute hand strength. What I mean by that is that before, we could see some of these suited hands raising, king 10 off being a raise fold, here we are, whereas now, these suited hands just fold, and we instead jam hands like ace 8 off, king 10 off, and so on. So some of these hands that we were raising before, I guess most notably king 10 off, is now a profitable jam because people will just call us wider. Queen jack off, just a fold, suited 9s, just a fold, low pocket pairs fold, ace 2 suited, also a fold. Our fold equity is way, way, way lower than before. Then, finally, I want to look at this spot. So, again, we have a starting bounty, but instead of having 10 big blinds, we are down to having 5 big blinds. So, when we go down to 5, here we are, we have some interesting things happening. So, we, again, get to jam, of course, reasonably wide. We only have 5 big blinds. But we jam significantly tighter than we would do in a normal vanilla tournament. We see hands like pocket deuces, they cannot jam because we don't have any fold equity. So they're not a profitable jam. Even some hands like ace deuce off. These suited hands, basically, because of our non-existent fold equity, we cannot be jamming wide at all. We have to jam a fairly strong range, which dominates a lot of the calls. Suited 8x still gets to make it, but they are fairly marginal jams. If we look at the EVs of the jam, you can see that something like 9-8 suited is at 0.04, whereas a hand like, say, pocket 4 is at 0.13, so massive difference between the two. And this can be extrapolated to our shorter stack size in general, that the bigger our bounties compared to our stack and the lower our fold equity, the less we should be jamming with suited hands basically in low pocket pairs. We want to try to dominate the weakest part of our opponent's calling range and not flip with it. So here, of course, the big blind is calling any two, therefore deuces are just not going to be profitable. We never get booked and deuces are flipping with pretty much everything. So now we can move on from money and let's look at a later position. Let's look at how Frankie is supposed to play on the button. So we assume that it falls to him, and how does Frankie get to play? Or how would we get to play in Frankie's shoes if it folded to us on the button? Again, Frankie has starting bounty, which is worth about 13 big blinds, and his stack is 21. Now, one thing that we see here is that the button gets to play at this stack size a limp or jam strategy only. We see this in normal vanilla tournaments as well, but mostly when we drop like at the 17 or 15 big blind stack size. we still get to mostly raise when we're at this 20-21 stack size. What changes in the bounty is that basically our effective stack size is reduced because of how much our bounty adds. And people will be rejamming a lot more on us. Therefore, by limping, we can VPIP a much wider range. We will talk about limping in detail in the limping chapter of the course, but I still think it's worth checking it out here. Okay, so we want to follow the same procedure that we did now. Let me close some of these tabs, where we basically want to look at how we should play in a normal GPV situation first. So source stack GPV, button, 20 big blind. Well, I guess for this one, I chose not to run the vanilla spot because I just think it's very, very similar to what we would see in a solver. Like the 20 big blind ranges are just super common, and we know that we mostly want to be raising, and the sim took a bit too long to run with limping in. So I thought it doesn't make too much sense. I can instead show you the result on GTO Wizard. Let me pull it up. Okay, so here it is. And limping isn't enabled in this kind of sim. It has the small blind and the big blind having a bigger stack size. The small blind has 40 and the big blind has like 50 something. So it's an accurate representation. And you can see that we're supposed to be raising about 43% of our range and doing a little bit of jamming, but mostly just raising. If we look at the limp-enabled sim, which is here, where everyone has 20, you can see that limping is just not really too much of a thing. It's mostly a mixed frequency, and there are very few hands that really want to limp. So when we have an even higher stack size of 21 big blinds, I think it's perfectly fine if we don't really incorporate limps to our game. But regardless, we're supposed to raise, as we said, about 44% when we're playing a normal tournament. Now, in the bounty example, as I said, we want to be playing a limp or jam strategy. So a few things that already stand out is regarding our jams. They are very different to what we would jam in a normal vanilla tournament situation. We saw that we wanted to be jamming the low pocket pairs and some of these offsuit ace-X. Now, we jam a way stronger range. We can see much stronger ace-X and our best offsuit broadways. And we jam way higher in pocket pairs. We don't jam pocket deuces anymore. We don't really jam pocket threes either. These hands are actually even losing jams, like threes and deuces don't make money as jams. Instead, we want to jam more of the middling pocket pairs that we have. We can also see that we pretty much never raise. So this is similar to us playing a lower stack size in the bottom. For example, if we had, say, 14 big blinds, then we can see that from the bottom, we want to, in a GPV vanilla situation, we want to play limps or jams only. So because of the bounty, our effective stack size goes down. Therefore, we just want to be playing limp or jams. Now, we can also see that the amount we limp is much lower than the amount we raised before, which again shows you how much tighter we have to play. Because when we play raises only, we still get to raise more than we get to limp here. We get to limp about 31% of our hands. So offsuit 9x, suited 7x, and then most of the suited queens as well, and the best suited connectors. Now, after we limp, our opponents are supposed to ISO a fairly wide linear range. This is the small blinds ISO range, and this is the big blind who is basically jamming or checking. There's no all-in raising from the big blind. When the small blind ISOs, then we continue like this. So we don't really fold. Because the ISO range is so wide, we can see that, yes, we have some jams, of course, but we just don't really fold hands. We're even calling our weakest limps at this point, which is definitely something to pay attention to and not overfold after limping. Our opponent, our small blind, is supposed to ISO really, really wide, and a lot of these hands have very poor playability from him. So hands like ace-4 off, ace-5 off, and so on. Therefore, we can't be folding like 10-9 off or jack-9 off, these kind of hands. If the big blind jumps on us, then we get to call a range that looks like this. So calling most pocket pairs, calling suited aces, our best broadways, even ace-6 off, ace-5 off are mostly calling. There's definitely a very big difference to how we play in a PKO scenario as opposed to the normal vanilla example. So next, I want to change this scenario a little bit as well. basically, what if we had, again, instead of the starting bounty, we had 1.5 starting bounties. So instead of 13 blinds added to the pot with our bounty, it would be around 19. How much tighter should we play then? Let's have a look. So button 15, or no, we said bounty first, so bigger bounty. There we go. And we can already see what happens is that we get to jam a lot more. Since we have very low fold equity, we actually want to jam more strong hands. And also we get to VPIP tighter because, again, people will just jam on us more. So now suited 7x, a lot of these suited queens, the offsuit 9x, they're basically thrown straight into the back. Even though we have the same stack size, the fact that our bounty is more significant makes us want to be jamming wider for value. Very linear again. You can see like we don't do any like bluff jumps. We jam the stronger hands that are in traps, and we limp significantly tighter. Again, in this spot, after we limp and the small blind ISOs, we don't really get to fold anything at this point. We also don't get to have bluff jumps, like we don't jam in ace 3 off or jack 10 suited. We just call with his hand and jam very linear again. This is a very common and reoccurring concept in PKOs, where we don't really have, I guess, bluff or blocker jumps when we are the shorter covered stack. We go very linear with value. Very often in normal vanilla tournaments, what we see is that we get to jam some blocker hands which fold out better, and then we jam, of course, top range, but we call the middle stuff. And now here we just go super linear. So you can see we jam king 10 suited, but we don't jam like offsuit a6. Very different to how it looks like in a normal tournament, but isn't PKO. And if the big blind jumps on us, we're supposed to jam like half his range. We, again, call really, really wide. We call king 6 suited, queen 9 suited, jack 10 suited, even king 9 off. So this is a spot where the big blind just get to go super, super wide just because of how important and how huge our bounty is. Because of how wide the big blind goes, we do not get to fold much from the bottom. We call most of our decent, strong hands. So now let's go back to us having the starting bounty, so 125. But let's change our stack size a bit. So we will follow the same stack size that we did for money. First, we want to see what happens when we have 15 big blinds instead of 21. So let me pull the sim up. Here we go. 15 big blinds. Here we are. Now, we see that at 15, we mostly just want to be jamming or folding. We do very, very little limping with these very specific hands, so aces and then some of these suited 9x. And again, we jam very linear for value. Hands like deuces just don't get to jam. We'd rather jam king 9 off than deuces because king 9 off just does better against calling range. If we have a quick look at the normal example at this stack size, like 14 big blinds, you can see that we get to limp a lot in a vanilla tournament and not jam as much. We also jam a bit of a different range, like we would never jam king 9 off, but we would always jam pocket deuces. And also we would jam a lot of these suited connected hands, like 10-9 suited, jack 9, queen 9, 10-8, and so on. Now in the PKO, this is way, way different. These hands are just folding, the suited 8s, and the suited 9s are the hands that limp. Deuces, just pure fold. Again, spot that a lot of people misplay, and it is pretty important for us to get right. We need to realize this difference in ranges when we are short stack and covered in PKOs, and the bounty is a big portion of our stack. When we limp, again, the small blind ISOs very, very wide, and we don't really fold anything. If the big blind jumps on us, we again just only fold some like 10-9 suited, jack 9 suited, jack 10 off kind of hands. Now, what if instead of us having 15 big blinds and starting bounty, we still have starting bounty, but we have 10 big blinds? Again, I run this for a normal vanilla tournament so we can compare. Let me have a look. Okay, here we go. So in a normal vanilla tournament, we want to be mostly jamming, but still having a bunch of limps. So we're jamming 38% in a non-bounty tournament and limping 6.8. Now, in the bounty tournament, when we have 10 big blinds, we basically don't play any limps at all. We only play jams, and we also jam quite a bit tighter than before. We would be jamming 38% and limping 7, whereas now we play jumps only and we jam 36%. We can again see that some of the hands which would limp before, like King 6 offsuit, as well as some of our traps, are just pure jamming now. Hands that were jamming, like these suited hands, are now pure folds, like these 9-7, you can see 8-7, always suited 8x as well, suited 7x. They are just not jamming anymore because our fold equity is almost non-existent. If we jam, the big blind is calling basically any 2, and the small blind is calling like half his range, or jamming half his range. So very, again, important spot to picture the differences between the two scenarios. We get to play much, much, much tighter. Well, I guess not much, but significantly tighter in the PKO as opposed to the normal vanilla tournament. And yeah, it's like 10%, right? We get to fold 55% in the vanilla, and we get to fold 64. So yeah, 9% tighter in the PKO version. Finally, if we had 5 big blinds, I think that's also worth checking. So we have starting bounty, but we have 5 big blinds on the bottom. How we get to play is this. So again, of course, no limps, and we get to jam a bit over half our range. Again, this will be a little bit tighter than the normal chippy V vanilla situation. And we again don't jam the suited connected hands, like these suited hands just not really jamming. But of course, we still get to go pretty wide because the pot is so huge and people will call us with any 2 cards. So we really want to jam pretty wide for value. So to summarize, we do see some very common concepts for PKOs that happen like every time we are short, which is that we want to avoid playing suited connected hands in especially spots where people are going to be 3-betting or jamming a lot on us. We can see that the difference from the early position isn't that huge because people behind, in theory, are supposed to be calling our open and not really 3-betting much. If they don't play as they should and they end up 3-betting a lot more, then we also get to open much, much tighter. On the contrary, when we are short on the bottom, because now people just really want to get it in against us, we adjust our strategy a lot. We play mostly with limps from these later positions and jumps. And we, again, want to really avoid jamming suited connected hands. We want to be jamming hands that do well and dominate the very wide calling range. And with that, we can wrap this chapter up and move on to the next one, where we examine how to play against opens and jumps. How do we respond to that?